Hello, welcome. My name is Alberto Espay from the University of Cincinnati. Today I'm interviewing Drs. David Knopman and Kaycee Sink. Dr. Knopman is a consultant in neurology at the Mayo Clinic, professor of neurology at the Mayo Clinic College of Medicine, and a co-investigator in the Mayo Alzheimer's Research Center. Dr. Sink is acting section chief, gerontology and geriatric medicine, medical director, Clinic Memory Assessment Clinic, in an associate professor of gerontology and geriatric medicine at the Stick Center on Aging Neurology from Wake Forest School of Medicine. Mouthful because you guys do so much. I want to thank you both because you were presenting the pro and con debate around the topic of cognitive enhancing activities. Do they prevent dementia? For the Controversies in Neurology plenary session that took place this morning at the American Academy of Neurology Annual Meeting. I want to thank you, David and Kaycee, both of you, for being here. And I want to start with the first question that has to do with the idea that we are all exposed to activities that will, perhaps using apps and other vehicles of that nature, force us to do perhaps activities that may be thought of as cognitive. So what is right and what is wrong with cognitive enhancing based on those kinds of vehicles? Who wants to start? David?
Well, I suppose there's nothing wrong but with any of them, but some of them are more socially engaging and some of them are more socially isolating. And Kaycee used a word earlier of just being, but the upshot of it was being just tuned into the screen and not to other people. And I think that's something to discourage because I think that from a broader perspective of caring for people, maintaining social engagement in late life is very important. And while there can be a component that involves doing things privately, that social engagement needs to be a big part of whatever older people are involved in.
That's a great way, because it actually tells me that then the issue with determining the scientific validity of using these kinds of apps that may dig into cognitive function or help with certain cognitive functions may in some level be games, in some other level perhaps detach people from the engagement that David is pointing out. Do you think, Kaycee, that this is something that the science behind the research you discussed nicely at the plenary session may be unable to tease out?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure that the science, well, I guess if I was younger, I might know more about this. I think the way that the online brain training games are now, they're very solitary. And they're kind of fun, actually. If you're a competitive person, you want to see your score get better, and our scores will get better when we practice these games.
Perhaps the more you do it, the less connected you are to other people.
Right, but then you sit in front of your video computer all day, you know, or for hours at a time. But I think so I think it'll be hard for science to use that technology and incorporate what I agree with Dr. Knopman about, which is that we need to stay socially engaged. And I always say to patients we should get twofers. So instead of your crossword puzzle, playing bridge might be better because you're with 3 other people at the table and you have a social engagement and a cognitive engagement. But maybe these science could work out more about these brain training games if they look to young children and teenagers who get in these online games against other people or in the same room as people. You know, like Wii, you probably wouldn't play Wii by yourself, but there's no science behind that at all.
Yeah. No, and one of the things that you both brought up at the plenary was the fact that this is but one element of the exposures that we all have as part of our education of sorts, right? And here you have so many elements, education, of course, itself being one of them, how long you've been in school, and what kinds of activities you do, what other lifestyle choices you've made. How can we look at this as a truly independent variable of either evolution into or away from dementia?
Well, I think we both are in agreement that people who tend to be cognitively who participate in cognitively stimulating activities are ones who are more likely to exercise. They're more likely, although there may be exceptions, of which I would be one, of having a healthy diets, who also engage in other appropriate health behaviors to avoid diabetes and hypertension, don't smoke cigarettes. So all these things are tightly linked. Unfortunately, they're strongly linked to socioeconomic status. And trying to disentangle these may be really a fool's errand, and that we should, like the finger trial, looking at an approach that goes after all activities that would promote healthy living and not try and isolate one. Now, that brings up the question of would that be suitable for a clinical trial? Because, well, you're mixing all kinds of different outcomes. But I think from a practical point of view, I don't see how you can isolate one.
Yeah, very good. And actually, talking about isolation, it reminds me what you, Kaycee, brought up in your discussion at the plenary, which was that the regulators ultimately shut down or did something to prohibit the claim that, in fact, any of the Lumosity type apps forestall dementia. If that's correct, I may be saying it not quite legalistically correct, but here's a question. The studies that you showed that were presumably used by the regulators to kind of stop that claim were based on individual tests that were doing something unique to specific cognitive domains, with the argument being that those domains were improved, yet the overall global function wasn't, and they perhaps, I don't know how much this was measured, but presumably also the time to dementia wasn't altered. So was there here a situation when you were perhaps looking at a too granular a level, where you're really kind of going down to the very basics of each of this and trying to say, okay, which games are going to be digging into this particular element of cognition and see what happens to that cognition, and then of course try to see what happens to others, when in fact it potentially could have been the case that you could have something that perhaps more globally addresses other cognitive domains and see if there might be ultimately an advantage to the risk of developing dementia or the time to dementia, whatever you're going to use to measure as an endpoint. What do you think about that? Do you think that is it possible that truly the study to do this, or the sort of the best evidence isn't really available, and therefore we cannot be conclusive about this?
Certainly with the brain training games, we just haven't had enough time. I think you can make that study. You can look at incident dementia outcomes, or even MCI if you want to be a little bit farther upstream, to the extent that we feel that MCI is a precursor of dementia. So I think in that sense, there's just not enough data to say that they're going to change an outcome. We can show that they can improve cognitive performance. We just don't know on the long term. But other studies prior to the computer world of these, the one that I mentioned called the active study that actually did train people up, wasn't able to show, they actually did have the data to look at incident dementia and to look at objective improvement on sort of daily activities like filling a pill box or reading a pill label, and they didn't find anything. So there's some realms where we have negative evidence. The evidence is that it doesn't work, and then there's a much bigger area where we just don't know.
Right, and again, it could potentially be just the idea that isn't quite built into lifestyle. David, one question and then the answer. One question will be, do you play Lumosity or any of these games?
No.
You don't, and it's interesting because you were for it in the debate.
No, I was not for Lumosity.
Well, no.
I was for mentally stimulating activities
Okay,
in
well.
general, and I was not, had no intention of endorsing Lumosity specifically. I spend enough time in front of a computer that I wouldn't do something like that. And I regularly also tell my patients that I think however much it costs, it is a waste of money compared to reading, playing bridge, doing crafts, and things like that.
Yeah, and that, in fact, then connects with what you were saying. You went from the active study, which was very much concentrated on these tools, these apps, and then to the finger study that was sort of more holistic in some ways. It was accounting for diet, for exercise, for the type of diet, if I recall correctly. And in that study, there were very small differences. You argued that the differences were so small as to be relevant. Although, I guess you can also make the case that they are different because the time frame is small, but that presumably if there is any separation between groups, long term, there might be a wider difference. Now, if we're going to pick, it sounds like we have more agreement than disagreement in general, but if we're going to pick a set of hierarchy elements here or add some order to what we think might have relevance for the risk of dementia, where would you put these cognitive enhancing activities? Would you put them kind of at the bottom related to educational background? Or would you actually have them put at the other end where it relates to elements associated with activities that people choose to do with their lifestyle, diet, exercise, etc.? Where are we? Where is this in the big spectrum? They're both thinking. In case for the podcasting audience, this silence is nothing but just synapses really working hard.
Well, totally rearranging. I mean, I think you have to put it in the context of a general healthy lifestyle, and that it can't be disentangled from from your propensity for education and your desire for learning, and in a globally engaged kind of lifestyle in general, and that it's never too early to start. I just don't know it's going to work if you start at 70.
So what are you telling your patients?
I tell my patients, this is probably the exact same thing that Dr. Knopman does, which is stay cognitively engaged, stay physically active, stay socially engaged. It's certainly not going to hurt them, even if I don't have a randomized controlled trial that's going to prove that they're not going to get dementia by doing this. We still want to promote a healthy lifestyle.
Absolutely. Well, you both have been terrific. I do recommend to anyone in the listening audience to check the website, because the talk will be up there for everyone to see. I want to see it again. I think the data you both shared was quite interesting, and I want to thank you for your contributions to both the plenary session and the American Academy of Neurology podcast. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.